Snow hushes Chicago, but inside St. Paul's the air fractures. A bouquet slips from Brittany Sutton's hands as the groom who promised forever never appears. Whispers sharpen like knives. Doors, once open to her name, begin to close. Then a quiet man steps from the shadows, a humble bookkeeper offering rescue with a single vow. Is he salvation or the first key to a locked past? As duty battles desire, a secret ledger waits to be opened, and one choice will redraw every line of her life. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from, what city, what cozy corner, and share this. In your favorite period romances, what wins your heart first, duty or desire? Chapter 1. The Ashes of a Name. Chicago, Illinois. January of the year 1875. Snow had fallen steadily since morning, covering the rooftops and gutters of the city with a soft white hush that belied the cruelty brewing inside St. Paul's Episcopal Church. The stained glass windows glowed like embers from within, casting flickers of crimson and gold upon marble columns and pearl-laced gowns. The guests, resplendent in fur-lined cloaks and silk gloves, sat in perfect formation, like porcelain figures, watching, waiting, murmuring behind lace fans and polished monocles. Brittany Sutton stood alone at the altar. Her gloved hands, ivory white and trembling, clutched the bouquet tighter as the silence grew unbearable. A single white rose dropped to the floor, and no one moved to retrieve it. The priest's throat cleared once, then again, and still no footsteps echoed from the nave. No groom, no redemption. The organist faltered. Someone gasped. In the back pews, a murmur rose, thick and immediate, like the smoke of a building catching fire. The groom's absence was no longer delay, it was abandonment. Her heart refused to break on command. It held stubbornly, as if unaware that everything she had been raised to believe in, lineage, duty, refinement, was now unraveling like a hem caught in the mud. The corset beneath her gown felt tighter than ever. A bead of sweat slid down the nape of her neck, vanishing into the fine lace her mother had hand-stitched weeks before. Her father, seated in the front row with his hat pressed against his chest, did not rise to offer comfort. His face, pale and drawn, was turned downward, as if trying to disappear into the stone floor. She knew then that this disgrace would not end with whispers. It would echo in the ledgers of every creditor, in the bills unpaid, in the way the doors of Chicago's elite would close softly, then firmly against them. Outside, bells rang for another wedding across town. Inside, the silence was her eulogy. The walk down the aisle, alone, was the longest journey Brittany Sutton had ever taken. Not one hand reached out to steady her. Her satin slippers whispered against the tiled floor as she passed her former friends, their mouths tight with pity or barely contained satisfaction. She kept her eyes ahead, as if dignity could be preserved by will alone. By the time she reached the vestibule, the tears had not fallen. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, "A Sutton does not cry in public." Her fingers tightened around the bouquet until the thorns bit into her gloves. Outside, the city waited with its usual indifference. Smoke curled from chimneys across the river. Horse-drawn carriages clattered over half-frozen cobblestones. Steam rose from sewer grates. It was a day like any other for Chicago, but for Brittany, it was the end of everything. She stood on the church steps as guests spilled out behind her, already shifting their attention, already searching for the next morsel of gossip. Snow clung to the hem of her gown. Her breath came in visible clouds, her cheeks burning with cold and shame. And then he was there. He had not emerged from the church, but from the shadows beyond it. A man of quiet bearing and plain attire, his coat dark with snow at the shoulders. He did not wear a boutonniere or silk cravat. His hat was simple, his boots unpolished. Yet there was something steady in his presence, like a lamppost left standing after a storm. "Miss Sutton," he said gently, his voice low but clear. "You don't know me, not really. My name is Elias Ward. I work "With numbers, for your father's shipping office." She blinked, uncertain if her shame had conjured him. Her fingers, still gloved, trembled. "I was inside," he continued. "I saw what happened, and I believe—" He paused, eyes meeting hers for the first time. They were a deep blue, startling in their calm. "I believe there's a way out of this, if you're willing." The snow fell thicker now, coating the steps in white. His offer hung in the air between them, as surreal as the silence that had preceded it. Brittany swallowed. Her voice, when it came, was hoarse. "Why would you—" "Because I've seen what this city does to women when their names are broken," he replied simply. "And I think yours deserves a chance to stand." Her pride, already shattered, offered no protest. Her heart, numb but still loyal to the idea of honor, recognized in Elias Ward not romance, but rescue. A flicker of something ancient and essential passed between them then. Not desire, but dignity. She gave the smallest of nods. By dusk, she was no longer Brittany Sutton, disgraced heiress. She was Brittany Ward, wife to a man of no apparent wealth, no title, no charm, save for the steadiness in his gaze. Her silk gloves were folded away that night. Her hair, once adorned with pearls, was twisted into a modest knot. The chamber where they first dined together was no ballroom. It was a narrow kitchen with cracked plaster and the scent of coal dust in the walls. He made her tea with hands stained by ink. She drank it in silence. The exile had begun, but so too perhaps had something else, something quieter than vengeance, steadier than shame, something that, like Chicago itself, might one day rise from the ashes. The first time Brittany Sutton, now Brittany Ward, stepped into the narrow stairwell that led to her new home, the scent of yeast and scorched sugar clung to the walls like a memory. It was late afternoon in the lower district of Chicago, where the buildings leaned inward as though conspiring in whispers, and the air hung heavy with coal smoke, chimney soot, and the damp breath of winter pressing in through the brick. The snow had begun to melt into grey slush, pooling in the cracks between cobblestones and soaking the hems of her skirt. She had never climbed stairs like these before, worn wood, uneven, creaking with every step. Each tread felt like a rejection of her former life, a farewell to marble floors and gilded banisters, a farewell to the echo of her mother's voice, reminding her that true ladies never raise their voices, never eat in the kitchen, never soil their sleeves. At the top of the staircase was a simple door, warped slightly by age, painted a dull green that had long since lost its shine. Elias reached it before she did, turning the key without ceremony. He pushed the door open and stepped aside, allowing her the first look into the space that would now be hers. The flat was small, 2 rooms. The front one was both kitchen and sitting area, lit by a single south-facing window, its panes fogged from within. The furniture was sparse, a narrow table, 2 mismatched chairs, a stove with rust along the edge, a shelf of cracked ceramic dishes. The second room, visible through a doorway without a door, held a bed of modest size and an iron wash basin on a stand. The wallpaper, once lightly cheerful, had faded into forgettable shades of beige and grey. Brittany stood still, her gloved hands curled at her sides. For a moment, she thought of the ballroom she had danced in last winter, of mirrored sconces and champagne flutes, and how none of those rooms had ever smelled of warm bread. "I know it's not much," Elias said behind her, setting down her small trunk. His voice was quiet but not apologetic. "But it's safe, warm, yours if you want it." She turned to look at him. His coat was still dusted with snow, his collar undone, and his cheeks ruddy from the cold. He did not look like a savior. He looked like a man who understood the weight of long silences. "I suppose I don't have many choices," she replied, her voice thinner than she intended. "No," he said, "but I promise you this. I'll never shame you." That night, she removed her gloves slowly and folded them with the care of ritual. The gloves went into the drawer of a chipped pine dresser that smelled faintly of lavender and coal. She did not cry. In the weeks that followed, Brittany learned to live in a space where silence was not laced with judgment, but with fatigue. Elias left most mornings just after breakfast, always dressed in the same ink-stained shirt sleeves, always with a ledger tucked beneath his arm. He returned in the evenings with a loaf of bread or a sack of coal, nodding in greeting as if nothing in the world had changed. She began to understand the rhythms of the street below. The bakery opened before dawn. The owner's wife, a broad woman named Mrs. Yarrow, sang off-key as she kneaded dough, her voice drifting up through the floorboards. A narrow alley behind the building served as a delivery point for sacks of flour and crates of eggs, always accompanied by the complaints of boys with cold fingers and tired shoulders. It was there, in that cramped little flat, that Brittany Ward learned how to clean with raw hands. The soap stung her knuckles and cracked her cuticles. She used vinegar to polish the windows, boiled water for washing linens, learned which corner of the stove burned hottest. The work was honest. It left her aching. But at the end of each day, when the floor shone and the bread cooled on the sill, a strange sense of peace curled around the edges of her exhaustion. She read the newspaper aloud to herself, circling notices about shortages and commodity prices. At night, with the window cracked just enough to hear the bakery's chimney creak, she stitched buttons back onto Elias's cuffs, humming lullabies she barely remembered. And yet, he remained distant, respectful, always, cordial. But he never touched her arm unless handing her something. He never asked her to share his bed, though there was no other. He slept on the edge, his back to her, or on occasion rose before dawn and returned smelling faintly of ash and city wind. One evening, as the wind howled between buildings and the window rattled in its frame, Elias came home later than usual. He looked weary, the kind of weariness that didn't come from walking, but from calculation. He set down his hat and opened a folded sheet of paper with creased corners. "I could use your eyes on this," he said, almost absently. "Numbers aren't coming out clean." She was seated at the table, mending a hem. She looked up, startled. He had never asked her opinion before, on anything. He laid the page between them, figures, columns, a string of names she did not recognize, and symbols beside them, barrels, crates, tons. Her eyes scanned the page instinctively. Her father had once taught her how to balance a ledger, how to spot a missing shilling in a sea of decimals. Her mind clicked into motion, soothed by order. "These two columns don't match," she murmured, tracing her finger along a row. "And this entry, this name appears more than once, but with different weights." Elias watched her, his jaw unmoving. "I thought the same." She looked up. "Is it a mistake?" "I'm not certain," he replied, "but I trust you see things others don't." The compliment slipped into her chest like warm tea, not for beauty, not for propriety, but for her mind. The next morning, Brittany descended the stairs before sunrise and bought a loaf of rye with the last of the week's coins. Mrs. Yarrow, who had long stopped pretending not to be listening, leaned in close. "You mind yourself, love," the baker's wife whispered, nodding toward a man in a black coat who had come twice in 3 days to ask questions about Elias. "There's freight trouble down by the rail, prices jumping like rabbits, and some don't like folks asking why." Brittany thanked her with a tight smile and stepped back into the snow. As she climbed the stairs with the warm loaf in her arms, her mind clung to the whisper, freight trouble, prices rising, and names repeating on torn paper. When she entered the flat, Elias was already gone. The room above the bakery felt small that morning, but not cold. The fire in the stove had not gone out in the night, and sunlight filtered through the window, washing the bare table in soft gold. Brittany set the bread down, brushed flour from her sleeves, and opened the ledger he had left behind. She did not know what she was looking for, only that something inside her had awakened. Not love, not yet, but something close to courage. The cold in Chicago that winter did not whisper. It pressed in like a sentence, clinging to windows, stiffening fingers, biting at the edges of every hour. Brittany had learned to carry heat in movement. Hands plunged into washwater, sleeves rolled as she scrubbed soot from the floorboards, breath steaming the panes of the small window above the table where she now worked in silence. She had begun transcribing ledgers by oil lamp, the scratching of her pencil, the only sound after the bakery closed. The books Elias brought home were simple at first. Receipts from a dry goods supplier, an inventory of delivered crates. But with each passing week, the numbers grew more complex, the shipments larger, the destinations broader than a neighborhood grocer could possibly need. When she pressed him, Elias only offered a calm shrug and a quiet, "Some clients keep me busy." She did not ask more than that, not at first. Their rhythm had settled into something wordless and careful. Elias rose before dawn, leaving a kiss pressed lightly to the top of her head when he thought she was asleep. In the evenings, he brought back small things without explanation: a pair of woolen gloves in deep plum, a jar of honey, a tin of violet pastilles that reminded her of childhood carriage rides through Lincoln Park. But it was the night he brought her a new ledger, larger, bound in dark leather, its corners scuffed with use, that something shifted. "Only if you want," he said, setting it before her on the table. "They're duplicates. My handwriting isn't always tidy." She accepted the task with a nod, though her heart quickened. Inside, the entries were neat but coded, rows upon rows of grain shipments, dates, weights, a column marked only W&Co, repeated like a pulse through every page. She paused, finger resting on the letters. "Is this one of your clients?" Elias, standing by the stove, paused mid-motion. "A partner of sorts. I handle some logistics." His voice was calm, but something in the room cooled beneath it. Brittany nodded and kept writing. That night, after he had fallen asleep, she traced those same letters again in the low glow of the lamp, W&Co. The ink had a different thickness, as if written by another hand. Some numbers didn't match. 2 crates entered, 3 recorded. A name, J. Elwood, appeared twice, both times tied to different warehouse districts. She didn't know why it unsettled her, only that it did. The next afternoon, alone while airing the bed linens, Brittany shifted the loose floorboard beneath the stove. It creaked sharply, catching on a rusted nail. Beneath it, wedged between dry kindling and a dented tin, lay something that gleamed faintly in the half-light. A pocket watch. It was polished silver, heavier than anything Elias had ever worn. The chain was thick, the face encircled with etched leaves. When she turned it over, her breath caught. ERW. The monogram was finely engraved in looping script, unmistakably elegant. The hands trembled in her grip. When he returned that evening, smelling faintly of snow and coal, she placed the watch on the table beside a bowl of potato stew. He looked at it for a long moment, then back at her. "I dropped it months ago," he said simply. "Didn't know where it had gone." "It's beautiful," she murmured, watching him. He gave a short nod. "A gift. From a client I helped recover some land titles." There was nothing in his voice to suggest deceit. Yet something in the way his fingers curled around the watch, possessive, careful, told her it had not been forgotten at all. She did not press further. But that night her sleep came slow and light. The mystery deepened days later when Mrs. Yarrow knocked softly at the upstairs door, cheeks pink from the oven heat, apron dusted in flour. "Forgive the intrusion," the baker's wife said, twisting her hands, "but you're kind with your time, and I thought you might want to help." She explained that one of her nieces, widowed just 6 months, was ill and alone, living near the river warehouses. "Can't do much now that her husband's gone. Caught in an accident he was. Barrels that weren't stacked proper." Brittany bundled a jar of broth and a wrapped loaf into a basket and walked alone to the river district, where the smell of wet wood and stale grain hung like fog. The houses leaned low here, their shutters crooked, porches softened by rot and salt. The young widow, pale and silent, accepted the food with a trembling smile. Her son, a boy of perhaps 5, hid behind a threadbare curtain, clutching a wooden toy worn smooth with use. Brittany sat for a while, speaking gently, until the woman's thin voice finally broke. "They told me it was an accident," she said. "But one of the others, he said the barrels were wrong, weighed wrong, that the foreman burned the receipts." "Burned them?" Brittany asked, heart stalling. "In the stove. Said it would confuse the inspectors if there were too many copies." The widow's eyes filled. "And now they say we owe the dock fee, even with Henry gone." When Brittany returned home, she climbed the stairs slowly, her gloves damp with fog, the breadbasket empty. She did not speak of it to Elias that night, but when she sat at the table, the ledger before her, she noticed it again. A single delivery marked for the same date as the accident. A grain shipment from W&Co's to Elwood Transit, but the weight scratched out and rewritten. No initials, no confirmation, and beneath the stove, beside the space where the watch had been, a charred corner of paper. Brittany touched it once, then drew back. Elias stood in the doorway, silent. She looked up slowly. "Someone is lying," she said. His face did not change, but the flicker in his gaze was unmistakable. "Then I hope," he said softly, "that you'll find out who." She did not know if it was permission or challenge, but she knew for the first time that whatever world Elias Ward belonged to, it was larger than the cracked windows and cold tea of the room above the bakery, and it carried secrets written in ink, in ash, and in silver. Chicago's dusk came early that February, not with brilliance, but with a slow dimming of the sky, as though the city had simply decided to close its eyes for a while. The fog rolled in thick from the river, muffling hoofbeats and lanterns, wrapping every alley in secrets. The gaslights flared gold and low, flickering in the wind that carried the scent of iron ash and frozen mud. Brittany Ward stood just outside the bakery, her gloves tight against the cold, her bonnet pulled low. She should have returned upstairs. The kettle on the stove would be nearly whistling by now, but Elias had passed the bakery door nearly a quarter hour earlier, walking with a pace too measured, too deliberate. He had not taken his usual path toward the freight offices, nor carried a ledger beneath his arm, and he had not looked back once. Something inside her had flared, an instinct more than a thought. She followed him. The streets of the lower district twisted without apology. Here, the soot lay thicker, and the windows of factories blinked open and shut like slow, tired eyes. Brittany kept her distance, careful not to let her footsteps echo. Her skirts caught on crates and spilled hay, but she did not stop. Elias turned left at the old iron bridge and crossed the street with the easy confidence of a man who belonged where he was going. He did not glance at the rickety warehouse by the docks, nor pause at the gates of the telegraph office. Instead, he approached a low brick building fronting the river, the kind of place with frosted windows and heavy curtains, where no names marked the entrance, but brass lanterns glowed like invitations to a world that did not tolerate strangers. She slowed, moving closer to the shadows of a shuttered stall. Through the haze, she watched as Elias adjusted his coat, removed his bowler hat, and stepped inside. A private club. She knew the kind. As a girl, she had passed them with her mother during Sunday rides, the whispered halls of gentlemen's societies where decisions were made that shaped freight lines and crushed fortunes, where women were never admitted and silence was a form of currency. Her father had never been invited. The Suttons had money once, but not the sort that bought entry behind velvet drapes and smoked glass doors. The doorman had not questioned Elias, not even looked him over. He had simply nodded. Brittany's pulse quickened. She moved along the building's edge, careful not to draw notice, and pressed herself against the wall near the rear. One window, narrow, cracked at the corner, had not been covered properly. Through the fractured pane, she saw silhouettes in motion, men seated in armchairs, coats fine and tailored, cigars glowing in the dimness. Crystal decanters caught the light. Murmurs drifted through the glass like wind through a graveyard. Her breath caught when one of the men leaned forward, Jonathan Elwood. She recognized him instantly, though she had not seen him in over a year. A man of ambition and steel, Elwood had courted every profitable rail line west of Ohio, and had once shaken her father's hand with fingers that felt like polished bone. Rumors said he had friends in Washington, enemies in New York, and that no contract crossed Illinois without his nod. He raised his glass toward Elias with a knowing smile. Elias, her husband, responded with the faintest tilt of his head. She could not hear what they said, but she watched the way Elwood laughed, the way Elias leaned in, one hand tucked into his coat, the other gesturing with slow precision. She saw ledgers exchanged, maps unfurled, and behind them all, the quiet watchfulness of men who controlled cities like others controlled puppet strings. One phrase, faint but clear, slid through the gap in the window. "Smooth the receipt." "We can't afford another panic," another voice responded. "What if the weight's off again?" A third man chuckled. "Then we pad the tally. Grain's not sacred." Brittany staggered back from the wall, heart racing. She knew enough now to understand the language. Padding tallies, smoothing receipts. It meant someone, somewhere, was falsifying records, manipulating the flow of grain that fed the city, and doing so to protect profits, not lives. And Elias stood among them, neither objecting nor walking away. She turned, boots sliding against ice, and walked quickly back toward the bakery. The fog had thickened, swallowing the lamps. A boy passed her with a sack slung over one shoulder, calling to no one in particular. "Price of flour's up again," he shouted. "Half wheat's near gone. Bread'll be dear tomorrow." The sound followed her like a curse. By the time she reached the apartment, her cheeks were flushed not from cold, but from the heat of betrayal she could not yet name. She shut the door behind her and leaned against it, heart pounding. The fire in the stove had gone low. The kettle had boiled dry. She did not weep. Instead, she moved to the small table, pulled out her worn notebook, and opened it to a fresh page. She began to write. One column for names, one for dates, one for shipments. She jotted down what she had overheard: grain, weight, padded tallies. She wrote Jonathan Elwood's name in bold, then circled it. Below that, she listed W&Co, underlined twice. She remembered the warehouse widow, the burned receipt, the delivery that had not matched the manifest. A pattern was emerging, quiet as ash, settling after a blaze. And at the center of it all, Elias Ward. She closed the notebook only when her fingers grew stiff from writing. The lamplight had faded. She sat still, hands in her lap, the silence of the room heavier than bricks. When Elias returned, later than usual, the scent of cigar smoke clinging to his coat, he paused in the doorway as though sensing the shift in air. Brittany did not greet him. He moved to hang his coat, then glanced at the stove. "You didn't eat." "I wasn't hungry." Their eyes met in the low light. He did not ask her why she was pale, or why her gloves still lay on the table, damp from the fog. He did not ask what she had done with her evening, and she did not ask what Jonathan Elwood had said. They stood in that pause, strangers divided by a ledger. Neither had written honestly, but something had sparked beneath the silence. Not hatred, not yet, but something burning, the kind of fire that doesn't start with a flame, but with a name. The invitation arrived folded crisply, inked with flourished handwriting and a gold-embossed seal that still bore the scent of violet wax. Brittany turned it over twice before opening it, the parchment smooth beneath her fingers. It came from Clara Wentworth, an old acquaintance from her former life, a name once familiar from the drawing rooms of Park Row and the parlor dances of early spring. A charity auction, the card announced, to benefit widows of the mill fire, all proceeds to be given in public. For several minutes, Brittany stared at the paper, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. She had not seen Clara in nearly a year, not since her own name had dropped from the society columns like a forgotten hymn. The sudden invitation felt less like a gesture of goodwill and more like a dare. Elias said nothing when she told him she intended to go. He merely looked up from his cup and asked, "Will you need me to escort you?" She shook her head. He nodded once and returned to the ledger. but his hand stilled for a moment longer than it should have. On the afternoon of the event, Brittany dressed with painstaking care. She wore her best walking gown, a dark amethyst wool with pearl buttons, pressed and brushed until it looked nearly new. Over it, she fastened her mother's winter cloak, trimmed in aged velvet, and pinned to the collar the brooch her mother had left her, a small golden rose set with a single garnet. Her gloves were repaired but clean, and her boots shined as best she could manage. She braided her hair back tightly, pinning it into a low coil that made her neck look longer, her face more austere. The event was held in a refurbished ballroom near Dearborn Street, a former carriage house turned gilded chamber, with gas sconces, high ceilings and floors polished until they reflected light like a mirror. The guests arrived in clusters, trailing perfume and laughter. Brittany stepped through the doors alone, and as the hum of conversation faltered slightly at her entrance, she lifted her chin. The first hour passed in polite observation. Brittany sipped lukewarm tea and nodded at acquaintances who gave her tight smiles and overbright eyes. She inspected the donated items on display, embroidered linens, watercolor portraits, a silver tea set likely donated out of fashion rather than generosity. Then came the whispers. They did not come all at once, but like the slow leak of air from a cracked window pane. Two women behind a curtain let their fans drop just low enough to murmur. She always was too proud, and now married to a clerk, they say. A bookkeeper, if one believes such things. Another voice, nasal and clipped, joined in. Clerk or not, someone saw him enter the Riverhall Club last week. You don't buy your way into Riverhall with ledgers and worn cuffs. A man nearby added with a dry chuckle, perhaps the Sutton girl's fallen farther than we thought, or perhaps higher, if her husband's name is what some suspect. Brittany's breath stilled. She turned away before they could see the flush rise in her cheeks. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her gloves. The brooch on her cloak suddenly felt too bright, too much like a target. She left before the bidding began. Outside, the street was darker than when she had arrived. The snow had turned to a soft rain, the kind that clung to wool and sank into skin. She walked quickly, ignoring the puddles that seeped into her boots, ignoring the sting in her chest that had nothing to do with wind. When she reached the flat above the bakery, the lamps inside were still unlit. Elias had not yet returned. She did not hesitate. His satchel rested by the hearth, worn leather slumped in a way that suggested exhaustion. She opened it gently. The ledger was there as always, but beneath it, tucked between sheaves of paper and a folded scarf, was a thick envelope sealed with a black wax emblem she did not recognize. Inside, there was a deed. The name leapt off the page. Elias Richard Ward, listed as sole owner of 3 major warehouses, including one at the southern docks, one she had seen named in the ledgers marked W&Co. Her breath caught, and for a moment the world tilted. She read it again and again. The ink did not change. She set the paper down slowly, her fingers numb. When the door finally opened, she did not move from her place by the table. Elias stepped inside, brushing rain from his shoulders, his gaze settling on her at once. He saw the deed in her hand and said nothing. "How long?" she asked, voice steady, despite the storm in her chest. He unwrapped his scarf and set it aside. "A while?" She stood. "You own them. Not represent, not consult. Own." He met her eyes. "Yes." Why didn't you tell me?" The silence that followed was not cruel. It was worse than that. It was patient, as though he had already considered every word and chosen none of them. She stepped back, as if struck. "You let me scrub your cuffs. You let me believe we were struggling, sharing cold bread and saving coins, while you held property deeds in your satchel." He did not offer excuses. His eyes, that usual quiet shade of winter blue, held something unreadable. Brittany shook her head, each breath rising harder than the last. "Was I your shield, a way to hide while the city turned? Or did you think marrying someone ruined would keep you invisible?" "Brittany," he said at last, softly, but she had no space left for gentleness. "You could have told me. You could have trusted me. Her voice broke, not with weakness, but with the pain of being treated like something fragile, something expendable. He took one step closer. She raised her hand. "Don't." That night, she did not change out of her cloak. She lay on the edge of the bed, the garnet brooch pressed cold against her collarbone, her back to him, her breath tight. He said nothing. He did not reach for her, but she felt his presence in the room, like heat from a fire never lit. And in that silence, brittle and endless, Brittany Ward understood what betrayal felt like. Not violence, not abandonment, but the erosion of trust, quiet and steady, like water carving away at stone, until nothing remains but dust. The morning after the silence was colder than the frost on the window panes. Grey light filtered through the thin curtains in their modest room above the bakery, casting long shadows over the uneven floorboards. The coals in the stove had long since gone out, and a chill hung in the air like a veil. Brittany sat on the edge of the bed, still wrapped in her cloak, her hands clenched in her lap, her spine impossibly straight. She had not slept, not truly. Every time her eyes closed, the image of the deed returned. His name, his ownership, the web of lies carefully spun from the very first moment he had offered her his hand in marriage. Behind her, Elias moved, quietly, carefully. He had slept on the chair by the hearth, or at least pretended to. He had not tried to speak in the dark, nor reach for her in the cold hours when loneliness softens fury. He had known better. Now, as the first signs of the city awoke below them, the clatter of milk pails, the distant crack of a cartwheel over stone, he rose and crossed the room. She heard the creak of the floorboards under his weight. He stopped near the table where last night's confrontation had unfolded in breathless fragments and unshed tears. "Brittany," he said, and her name in his voice was a quiet thing, heavy with something she could not yet forgive. She did not answer. He waited a moment. Then slowly he spoke again. "I was born Elias Richard Ward," he said, "son of Benjamin and Lillian Ward. My father built a modest freight business with his brothers. It was never the largest, but it was solid, honest, until the fire." She turned her head slightly, just enough to see him in profile, his face pale in the winter light, his jaw tense, his eyes fixed not on her, but on the empty space between them. "We lost everything in the fire," he said. "Everything that wasn't burned was stolen afterward, by men who called themselves bankers, brokers, friends. While we sifted ash, they bought the deeds out from under us. My father died that year, my mother the next. I stayed. I rebuilt." He looked at her now, and his gaze held nothing but truth. "But I rebuilt in silence, without names, without favors. I created W&Co not to impress, but to survive, to protect what I had left, and to keep it far from the hands of those who use power to corrupt and control." She stood then slowly, her arms still crossed. Her voice was low, controlled. "And you decided that I, your wife, did not deserve to know who you truly were?" He inhaled deeply. "I didn't plan it like this. At first it was easier, cleaner. I thought I could keep both lives separate. Then, you came to mean more to me than I expected." Her expression did not soften. "So you tested me." "No," he said quickly, stepping toward her. "It wasn't a test. It was, wasn't it?" She snapped, her eyes gleaming. "You offered me a name that wasn't yours, a future you never meant to share. You watched me patch sleeves while your warehouses turned profit. You let me beg a baker for a second-day loaf while you signed contracts with Elwood." His silence was answer enough. She stepped back. "You say you wanted to see if I could love a man without fortune, but you never gave me that chance. You were never just a clerk, never just a man surviving." Elias's jaw tightened. "I wanted to protect you." "From what? The truth?" Her voice cracked, raw, with a hurt too deep to mask. "You didn't protect me. You stripped me of choice. You made me feel small, unworthy of truth, of partnership." He looked as though she had struck him. "I never meant to make you feel that way. And yet you did." For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the whistle of the wind beyond the window and the distant bell of the early coal delivery. Finally, Elias said, "Everything I've done for survival. I lived too long watching people use others for sport. I swore I would never be used again, but somewhere in protecting what I built, I forgot that trust is part of survival too." Brittany's breath caught. Her throat ached. She looked at the man before her, not the clerk she had married, not the figure she had glimpsed in the shadows of Riverhall, but someone in between, a man with ink-stained fingers and a heart layered in ash and armor. "You built an empire," she whispered, voice trembling, "but you couldn't build a marriage." Those words settled between them like falling snow. Light, cold, irreversible. Elias swallowed hard. "I wanted you to choose me for who I was beneath the name." Her eyes narrowed, the ache in her chest sharp and unyielding. "And yet you gave me no choice at all." She turned away then, not in dismissal but because her heart could not bear the sight of him any longer. Elias stood for a moment more, then quietly crossed the room, picked up his coat and walked out the door without another word. When it closed behind him, Brittany sank slowly into the chair by the table. Her hands rested atop the deed she had left open. The paper crackled beneath her fingers. She stared at the signature, Elias Richard Ward, and for the first time she realized she had no idea who her husband truly was. The truth had finally come to light, but its warmth was not comfort. It was fire, the kind that raises, the kind that does not ask for forgiveness before it burns. The smoke rose before dawn. Brittany smelled it before she saw it, thick and acrid, curling through the winter air with a heaviness that did not belong to chimney soot or hearth smoke. It was the sharp, unmistakable stench of burning timber and oil. By the time she opened the window, cries were already echoing through the street below, and ash floated gently past the panes like black snow. The bakery door had been flung open. Mrs. Yarrow stood outside in her shawl and apron, hands clutched to her chest, her face pale with something more than fear. "It's the South Dock warehouse," she whispered to no one in particular. "The one behind the grain line. The roof's gone." Brittany's heart seized. She pulled her cloak tight and rushed into the street, where neighbors gathered in knots, their breath misting in the cold, eyes fixed in the direction of the rising plume. It took less than an hour for the news to spread. 2 workers, brothers, both Irish immigrants, had died beneath the collapsed roof. Others were injured. The flames had consumed half the stored grain, and the building now smouldered, watched by men too weary to curse and too poor to grieve aloud. Brittany stood among them, her boots soaked, her gloves stained with ash. She said nothing, but inside her something splintered. That afternoon she returned to the meeting room in the back of St. Margaret's Parish, where she had begun quietly organizing with labour wives and churchwomen weeks earlier. The long wooden table was covered in hand-stitched tablecloths, but the mood in the room was sombre. Widow Donovan passed out chipped mugs of barley tea, while 2 young women, their aprons still dusty from the mills, whispered about the explosion. "They knew," said one. "That roof was rotting. My husband said they asked for reinforcement beams months ago." The other nodded. "But it wasn't in the receipts, not officially." Brittany sat down and unrolled her notes. Columns and names and shipment tallies copied in her careful hand. She traced the lines again. Falsified weights, dates with no matching invoices, crates that changed size from ledger to dock, warehouse numbers repeated with quiet insistence, all tied to the same insignia. W&Co. And beneath the ledger marks, a trail of silence, workers who had been paid to look away, inspectors who had been redirected, widows offered coin in place of answers. She gathered every scrap and walked home as twilight fell. Elias was already there, seated at the table with his sleeves rolled, his brow furrowed as he scanned a shipment report. He looked up as she entered, but whatever words he might have said died on his lips when he saw her face. She dropped the ledgers in front of him. 2 men are dead. He stared at her, expression unreadable. "And this," she said, her voice low but unyielding, "is why." He leafed through the papers slowly, his eyes narrowing at the annotations, the stamps. She could see his jaw tighten, could hear the faint catch in his breath as he found the pattern she had already followed to its end. "These were falsified," he said finally, quietly, "under your name." A long silence passed between them. "I didn't authorize this," he said. "These orders, these adjustments, they weren't mine. But they were signed under your seal," she replied. "Your men, your oversight, or lack of it." Elias stood and walked to the window. The sky outside was purple, the last light fading behind the smoke that still hung low over the city. "They exploited my absence," he murmured. "They used the gaps I left behind." Brittany crossed the room, her voice sharper now. "Then close the gaps. Expose them." He turned to face her. "You think it's that simple?" "No," she answered. "I think it's necessary." His eyes held hers, tired, dark, layered in something heavier than pride. "I've spent years building this company," he said. "I built it to survive the corruption that killed my father. If I drag this into the open, if I name names, W&Co will burn. My name with it." She stepped closer. "And if you do nothing, it burns anyway. Only this time with blood on your hands." Elias looked at her, and for a moment the quiet between them returned, not the silence of resentment, but the fragile stillness of two people staring into the same fire from opposite sides. A knock at the door broke it. A messenger boy, breathless and muddy, handed Elias an envelope. He opened it without ceremony, his eyes scanning quickly before he sighed and handed it to her. The Board of Trade had called for a hearing. The tone was neutral, the intent was not. Brittany folded the paper and held it tightly in her palm. "What will you do?" Elias sat again. He didn't speak for several seconds. "I don't know." She studied him, the man who had once offered her safety without truth, who had built walls around himself even as he invited her to share his name. He had created a life of shadows to protect what little light he believed he had left, and now that light stood in danger of being extinguished by the very secrecy that once shielded it. "I know what I will do," she said quietly. Elias raised his head. She moved to the stove, picked up her notebook, and ran her hand across its spine. "I will speak. At the parish. At the hearing, if they let me. I'll show them what I've found." His face darkened. "They'll destroy your name." She met his gaze, unwavering. "They already tried, and you didn't stop them." The wound in her voice was real, but it no longer bled. It had hardened. It had learned to stand. Elias looked away. Brittany walked toward the door and stopped beside him. For a brief second, her hand brushed his shoulder, not in comfort, not in forgiveness, but in recognition. "I never asked you to be perfect," she said. "Only honest." She left without another word. That night, Elias remained at the table long after the lamps had burned low. The ledgers lay open before him. The silence wrapped around him like smoke. He knew the cost of survival, but now he had to decide the cost of redemption. The morning of the hearing dawned without color. Grey clouds hung low over the city, blurring the line between earth and sky, as if Chicago itself held its breath. The streets were slick with melted frost, and the air carried the scent of coal, paper, and unease. A soft drizzle fell, not enough to cleanse, only enough to stain. Inside the small room above the bakery, Brittany stood before the mirror, fastening the last button of her slate-blue gown. The fabric was modest but precise, the sleeves fitted, the skirt heavy with the careful folds of dignity. She had brushed her hair into a low twist, held not by jewels, but by a single tortoise-shell pin. Around her neck she wore no brooch, no ribbon, only the weight of her resolve. Behind her the table was stacked with what she had gathered over the past week. Smudged ledger pages, scorched fragments of shipping receipts, witness statements scrawled in clumsy handwriting and ink stains. The voices of men who loaded crates in the dark, who had seen the numbers shift before their eyes, the names of foremen who signed papers with trembling hands after quiet visits from men in grey coats. She gathered the pages into a parcel, tied it with twine, and slipped it beneath her arm. Outside, the wind bit through her gloves as she stepped into the street. The bakery had not opened yet, the shutters were closed, but from behind them, she thought she heard Mrs. Yarrow whisper a quiet prayer. The Board of Trade loomed over LaSalle Street like a courthouse of power. Its sandstone facade was marked by soot and age, but its columns still stood as tall as justice once pretended to be. Inside, gaslights flickered in iron sconces. The floor was marble, polished, cold. Brittany walked past the clerks who barely looked up from their desks. She did not flinch when one man raised an eyebrow at her dress, or when another muttered under his breath, "She's the wife." Let them whisper. Let them doubt. She had not come to be believed. She had come to be heard. In the chamber, a long wooden table stretched before a raised platform where the board members sat in a row. 8 men, most in their 60s, grey-bearded and pale-eyed, their cuffs starched, their expressions practiced in skepticism. At the end of the table stood a lectern. She stepped behind it. They asked no questions, not yet. She untied the parcel and laid out the evidence with calm hands. "My name is Brittany Sutton Ward," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor of her heart. "I am here not as the wife of a name you know, but as the witness to a crime you allowed." That earned a glance, then a murmur. She continued, "I have here receipts falsified to disguise overweighed crates, statements from dock workers instructed to look away, contracts rerouted through front companies, all bearing the seal of W&Co, but not the consent of its rightful owner." Her hands moved across the papers as she spoke, displaying signatures, alterations, fragments burned at the edges, but still legible enough to reveal what had been hidden. They said the grain would arrive dry. It was wet. They said it was clean. It was spoiled. They said 2 men died by accident. They lied. Her voice did not rise, but it grew sharper, more cutting than any shout. They profited while families paid 4 times the price for bread, while widows swept ash from tables that once held food, and they did it beneath this board's silence. One of the men cleared his throat. "Do you have any proof that these accusations connect directly to those seated on this board?" Before she could answer, the doors at the back of the chamber opened. Elias stepped inside. Gaslight glinted off the polished leather of his shoes, the deep navy of his tailored coat, the crisp line of his vest. He wore no disguise now, no ink stains, no patched elbows. The murmurs spread like a wave. He walked forward, calm and unhurried, and stopped beside Brittany without looking at her. When he spoke, it was to the room. "My name is Elias Richard Ward. I am the sole owner of W&Co. The silence that followed was not surprise, it was confirmation. "I did not know of these actions until recently," he continued, his voice resonant, "but I take responsibility for the name they used, and for the men I trusted." He reached into his coat and pulled out another packet of documents. He placed them on the table. "These are copies of internal communications, contracts signed without my consent, payments funneled through Jonathan Elwood's brokerage. They implicate 4 managers, 2 board liaisons, and at least 1 inspector under your charter." Gasps rose. One of the board members stood. "That's a serious claim, Mr. Ward." "Yes," Elias said with quiet fury, "and a true one." For a moment, Brittany forgot to breathe. She turned her head slightly, just enough to see the tightness in his jaw, the fire banked in his eyes. He had removed the mask. He had stepped into the fire. The board fell into chaos. Voices overlapped. Accusations clashed. Some demanded an inquiry. Others called for resignations. And a few, their eyes hard with fear, whispered of legal action. But none could undo what had been spoken. When the chamber finally quieted, one man, the eldest, spoke at last. "Mr. Ward," he said carefully, "do you understand the damage this will do to your name, your company?" Elias did not flinch. "My name has already been damaged. I am here to restore what it should have stood for." The man turned to Brittany. "And you, Mrs. Ward, what is it you hope to gain from this?" She lifted her chin. "Bread," she said. "That costs what it should. Honor that means what it claims. And a name, my own, that will no longer be spoken in pity, but in truth." She did not wait for their reply. She gathered her papers and walked out of the room, her steps slow and deliberate. Elias followed a moment later. Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds remained, but the air smelled fresher, as if something had shifted. They stood at the top of the steps, side by side, not touching, not speaking. He turned to her. "Thank you," he said simply. She looked at him, not as a stranger, not as the man who had hidden, but as someone who had finally chosen to stand beside her. "Don't thank me," she said. "Just don't forget." And for the first time in her life, Brittany Ward felt the full weight of her own name, not as a shadow, not as a burden, but as something earned, and she carried it into the rain like a banner. Spring came quietly to Chicago that year. No grand thaw, no ceremonial shedding of winter's weight. Only the soft dripping of snowmelt down the alley walls, the trembling of crocuses pressing through blackened soil, and the scent of bread rising from ovens at dawn. It arrived the way healing does, not with fanfare, but with patience. On the corner of Halstead and 22nd, beneath the faded green sign of Yarrow's Bakery, the storefront that had once stored flour and firewood now bore a new name: the Fair Table. The lettering was hand-painted, neat but modest, and behind the freshly cleaned glass stood rows of loaves priced by weight, jars of preserves with honest labels, and bolts of muslin stacked beside ledgers and quills. It was not a shop that promised wealth. It promised fairness. Inside, Brittany adjusted the hem of a widow's shawl with careful fingers. The older woman, Mrs. O'Shea, had come for the weekly accounting lesson and stayed to weep over a letter she could not read until now. Beside them, a girl no older than 12 practiced columns in pencil while her younger brother sorted dried beans for the parish kitchen. There was no ceremony to it, no reward, but in the rhythm of it, pencil, bread, story, arithmetic, Brittany found something closer to peace than she had known in years. The sunlight stretched through the lace curtain as she poured tea for Mrs. O'Shea, folding the letter and tucking it back into the envelope with the gentleness one gives to something sacred. Outside, Elias stood watching. He did not enter immediately. He often lingered now on the stoop by the window at the edge of her voice, not out of fear, but out of reverence. As if he knew that this quiet world she had built did not require him, but welcomed him anyway. When he did come in, the children greeted him like a familiar guest, and Brittany offered him tea without needing to ask. He sat in the corner, reviewing shipment requests and worksite evaluations, his sleeves rolled and ink on his fingers once more. The weight of W&Co still hung on his shoulders, but it no longer bowed his back. It had taken weeks. After the hearing, there had been letters, investigations, the slow unwinding of names and numbers and signatures. Elwood had disappeared to New York before papers could be served. 2 managers resigned without comment. One foreman was dismissed quietly, and another sent a letter of apology that Elias kept folded in the drawer by the hearth. Elias did not run from it. He ordered independent inspections across every warehouse, hired a firm from Detroit to audit weight measurements without bias, met with dock workers and loaders not in back rooms but in open daylight. He posted a public notice of reforms and allowed the newspapers to print it in full. He tore down the wall behind which he had hidden and began, plank by plank, to build something else. At first, Brittany had not known what to say. Trust, once cracked, does not mend with words. It requires time, observation, 100 small choices repeated without demand. He did not rush her. She watched him, watched the way he carried his silence differently now, not as armor, but as responsibility. He did not explain himself often, but when he did, the words were not meant to impress. They were meant to be true. One evening he returned home with a bag of wood stain and a folded paper of renovation plans. He spread them out on the table and asked, without expectation, "Would you like your own key to the back room of the storefront?" She looked at him then, not past him, not through him. "Yes," she said simply, "I would." Their rooms above the bakery changed slowly, but meaningfully. The wallpaper was stripped, revealing brick they chose to leave bare. New curtains were sewn from calico. The warped green door was replaced with one of stained oak, which Elias carved himself, initials discreetly etched along the inside frame. The bedding was replaced. So was the silence. It was no longer a silence of pain, but one of shared breath, of glances across morning tea, of stories read aloud by the stove, of words that did not need to be said because the meaning already lived in the space between them. Brittany no longer flinched when he reached for the kettle beside her. Elias no longer hesitated before he asked, "Will you join me at the docks tomorrow? I want them to hear your voice too." And one evening, as the sun filtered through the lace, casting golden patterns on the pine table, he reached across the worn surface, his hand open. Brittany looked down at it. It was a hand she had studied in moments of doubt, in flashes of fury, in years that felt like lifetimes compressed into silence. It was a hand that had once withheld truth, then held it out with trembling fingers. She set hers into it, not because everything had been forgotten, but because something had been rebuilt. A trust not born of declarations, but of repetition, of quiet faithfulness, of work done without applause and love offered without possession. He closed his fingers gently over hers, and she did not pull away. Later that night, they walked through the neighborhood together. No destination. Just the rhythm of footsteps along familiar cobblestones, lantern light dancing across rain-washed windows. Children waved from stoops. A man from the grain office tipped his cap. The baker's daughter handed them 2 sugar twists without charge. They did not belong to society. They belonged to something else, something quieter, something earned. When they reached the stairs to their home, Brittany paused, her hand still in his. "I would like to repaint the storefront door," she said. He glanced at her, puzzled. "It was just stained." "I want to add something," she said, a smile just barely tugging at her mouth. "Below the name." He waited. She spoke slowly, each word deliberate, established in ashes, sustained in truth. Elias smiled. He nodded once, and together they climbed the stairs. It was the 1st of October, 4 years to the day since the Great Fire had swallowed half the city and taken with it churches, homes, ledgers, names. The bells of St. Joseph's tolled slowly in the distance, not to mourn, not to warn, but to remember. Chicago breathed with a different rhythm now, scarred but upright, changed but standing. The morning was crisp, with a wind that carried the scent of river water and ash, long buried beneath brick and bloom. Overhead, a sky of soft slate rolled above the rooftops, the clouds full but unmoving, as if the heavens themselves had paused in reflection. At the edge of the river, just beyond the grain docks, and past the still blackened bones of a factory that had never been rebuilt, stood a small chapel, rebuilt by hand, brick by brick, by the very people who had once wept on its ashes. It bore no stained glass. Its doors were plain. The wood pews had been sanded down from salvaged beams, and its altar held no gold, only light. That morning, the doors stood open. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of beeswax and pine. The walls whispered with the sounds of arrival, boots scuffing the floor, skirts brushing the aisles, the soft hush of greetings exchanged by calloused hands. There were no lace gloves, no brocade waistcoats, no orchestra waiting in the loft. Only people, real people, bakers and dockhands, widows and orphaned boys, a boy with one shoe, cradling a folded paper in his pocket, a woman from the co-op whose child clutched a borrowed hymn book-like treasure. They had come not for spectacle but for truth, and at the back of the chapel stood Brittany. She wore no veil. Her gown was of slate-blue wool, tailored simply with long sleeves and a modest high collar. There were no jewels at her throat. only the memory of choices that had cost her everything and the pride of having built something better in their place. Her hair was pinned in a soft twist, a few strands escaping to frame her cheeks, kissed pink by the cold. "Mrs." Yarrow adjusted the collar gently and whispered, "You've never looked more like yourself." Brittany smiled, eyes shining with something deeper than happiness. "It's the first time I've felt it." When the bells rang once more, the crowd turned. From the far side of the chapel, Elias entered. He wore a dark waistcoat, clean but unadorned. No hat, no gloves, no disguise. His hair had been neatly combed, but a lock still fell across his brow. He had trimmed his beard, but left the lines soft. And he walked with a bearing that no longer tried to shrink or cloak itself. He walked like a man who had once lost everything, and had chosen deliberately to begin again. He stopped just beside her, and did not offer his hand, not yet. They stood side by side in the doorway, neither one needing to be led. Then with slow steps they crossed the threshold together. At the front of the chapel, an elder from the parish awaited them. Not a priest, but a man who had survived the same fire, buried the same ashes, and now spoke with the gravity of someone who knew what a vow meant when the world burned around it. The chapel fell silent. The elder did not ask if anyone objected. He asked only if they were ready. Brittany turned to Elias and he to her. The moment was not rehearsed. It did not need to be. Elias spoke first, his voice low but resonant, like the creak of timber settling after a storm. "I do not vow what I cannot keep. I do not vow never to fall nor never to fail. I vow instead to rise, to rebuild, to be seen and to see you. No shadows, no half-truths, only us. As we are, as we choose to be." He paused, eyes steady on hers. "And I vow that when the next fire comes, if it does, I will not run. I will stand beside you." Brittany's breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted them, palms open between them. "I do not vow to forget," she said, her voice quiet but sharp as a blade dulled by use. "I vow to remember. To remember who we were before the silence, before the lies, before the hunger that made us both afraid." She looked down at their joined hands and then back to his eyes. "But I vow also to believe again, to build again, to speak always, and to listen even when it hurts." The elder nodded and asked if they would seal the vows. Elias took her hand, and this time when he held it, she did not resist. She stepped closer. No rings exchanged, no kiss demanded. Just silence. The kind that speaks of respect, the kind that means everything that once needed to be proved had already been lived. The chapel did not erupt in applause. Instead, the crowd rose to their feet, slowly, with reverence. Some wiped their eyes with handkerchiefs. Others bowed their heads. A boy clapped once and was gently hushed. Outside, the bells rang for a third time. Brittany and Elias stepped out into the open air, the wind curling around them like the memory of 100 untold stories. The soot that still clung to the highest chimneys seemed less like a stain and more like a shadow finally learning to lift. They walked slowly through the streets, hand in hand. No carriage followed them, no fanfare led the way. But as they passed the bakery, Mrs. Yarrow waved from the doorway. At the grain depot, 2 foremen tipped their hats. The seamstress from the storefront held her child up high so he could see, and in every glance, every nod, there was recognition, not of scandal, not of pity, but of worth. Of 2 people who had walked through fire, not to be purified, but to be understood. As they reached the steps of their building, Brittany looked up at the sky. The clouds had begun to break, revealing soft streaks of sunlight that shimmered like gold dust across the rooftops. She turned to Elias. He squeezed her hand gently. "We're home," he said. And together they climbed the stairs, not toward what had been, but toward what they had chosen to build with nothing but truth in each other. A life not untouched by fire, but promised beyond it. The wind had turned again. It came through the alleys of Chicago with a bite that hinted at the coming frost, carrying the scent of chimney smoke, drying leaves and something else, softer, quieter, memory. Brittany stood at the window of the bakery's upper flat, her hands resting on the sill worn smooth by years of morning watching. Below, the storefront bustled with life. Children darted between wooden crates, their laughter echoing in the street. The bell above the bakery door chimed with each arrival. Neighbors, widows, delivery boys, women with baskets, old men who now read the paper over free coffee and fresh bread. The co-op had grown. What once was a narrow shop tucked between smoke and soot was now a place of learning, of gathering, of refuge. The reading circles Brittany began with only 3 mothers, now welcomed dozens each week. The accounting lessons, once held around a single borrowed ledger, had turned into small business training for widows and war wives seeking independence. It had been 5 years. 5 years since the vows spoken in the river chapel, 5 years since W&Co shed its silence and embraced the light. Elias had kept his promise. Inspections became standard, and ledgers were opened not just to shareholders, but to workers. The company was smaller now, leaner, slower to expand, but it stood as one of the most trusted names in the trade. Integrity had a cost. Jonathan Elwood, the powerful broker once seen laughing behind club doors, had not survived the reckoning. Public disgrace led to exile, and a fall from power so steep it made headlines across the country. No charges were ever brought. His allies too many, the law too forgiving, but his name had become a cautionary tale. He vanished into the margins of forgotten men. Brittany never spoke his name again. The real price, however, had been paid more quietly. Elias had walked away from a world that had once crowned him. Invitations stopped coming. Former partners turned cold. Men he had once dined beside no longer met his eyes. And yet he never once expressed regret, because in those 5 years, something far richer had grown. Footsteps approached the bakery below, and Brittany smiled. She knew them well, slow, confident, uneven in the way that came from favoring one leg after a tumble taken too fast down the back steps chasing a toddler. The door opened, and a voice rose up the stairwell. Someone asked if the muffins today were made with cinnamon or treason. Brittany laughed. Tell them both. Revolution tastes better that way. Elias appeared a moment later, brushing flour from his vest. He had let the grey streak through his hair without shame. His hands were rougher, his shoulders broader now, from carrying sacks rather than secrets. He crossed the room with a familiarity carved over time and leaned to kiss her forehead. Your daughter, he said, has decided that cinnamon is the enemy. Brittany turned. At the center of their living space, now bright with linen curtains, honeyed wood, and a warmth no fire could destroy, sat a little girl no older than 4, curls bouncing as she flipped through a picture book upside down. Genevieve, named for a woman Brittany had once watched stitch her husband's shirt by candlelight, refusing to crumble when the warehouse burned. She's your daughter when she's stubborn, Brittany said gently. She's always my daughter. Even when she hides your spectacles in the flour sack. A voice rose from the stairwell, Mrs. Yarrows, still spry at 72, carrying up news of a delivery and a prayer request from the church. Tell her I'll come down in a moment, Brittany called back. Elias knelt by their daughter and adjusted her small cardigan. He brushed a kiss over her cheek, and the child looked up and said solemnly, I fixed the muffins. I used all the cinnamon so no one else could. He laughed. I see. Outside the window, the city had changed. Rail lines ran farther now. The soot-stained walls had been scrubbed, the factories tempered by new laws and louder voices. Bread prices had not fallen to pre-fire levels, but they had steadied, and for many that was enough. Dignity had returned to places that once only knew hunger. Brittany watched a group of women walk past the bakery, each one carrying ledgers she had taught them to balance. A boy tipped his cap to her from the corner, then ran back toward the church, where a new school was being built. She turned to Elias. Do you ever miss it? She asked quietly. The The boardrooms, the clubs, the power. He looked at her for a long moment, then reached for her hand. "No," he said. "I have everything I ever wanted, and none of it came the way I thought it would." She squeezed his fingers. In 5 years they had not become perfect, but they had become true. They had built something not from the grandeur of the past, but from its ashes. They had learned the language of silence and forgiveness. They had learned how to fight without wounding, how to speak without retreating. And most of all, they had learned that love, real love, was not the thunderous promise of the altar, but the quiet repetition of days that chose to stay. Brittany kissed his cheek and walked toward the stairs. "Coming, Mrs. Yarrow," she called. Behind her, Genevieve stood on wobbling feet, determined to carry a tray half her size. Elias followed, steadying her from behind. And together, under the soot-washed sky of a city that remembered both fire and healing, the family moved forward. Not as a legend, but as something better, as proof that even in the coldest places, with truth and time, something warm could grow. What a journey, dear listener. Brittany and Elias began as two strangers, one humiliated at the altar, the other cloaked in secrets. But through fire, betrayal, and silence, they forged something rare. Not a perfect love, but an honest one. One built not on wealth, not on titles, but on choice, on forgiveness, on quiet strength. And isn't that the lesson hidden in the coal dust and ledgers of this story? That sometimes the greatest victories are not loud. They do not happen in ballrooms or headlines. They happen in kitchens scented with bread, in rooms warmed by trust, in the reaching of one hand, and the decision not to pull away. If this story stirred something in you, if you found yourself holding your breath, or wiping a tear, or smiling at the thought of second chances, I invite you to tell us in the comments. And if you made it all the way to the end, write the word resilience, so we know you walked with Brittany every step of the way. Your presence here means the world to us. Truly. If you wish to support the passionate team behind these stories, you can send us super thanks in any amount. Every gesture, no matter how small, helps us continue weaving these emotional tapestries for you and thousands of other period romance lovers. And if today isn't the right day for that, no worries at all. Sharing this story with a friend, sister, or fellow dreamer is another beautiful way to keep it alive. And don't forget, if you're craving more tales of strength, secrets, and unforgettable love, I've linked other powerful romances for you in the video cards above. Each one is a world waiting to welcome you. Thank you for being part of this one. We'll see you in the next chapter.